The house key stuck in the lock, the way it always did in the damp coastal air, and Vespera Vance had to shoulder the front door open like she was breaking into her own home. 16 hours of flights, 3 time zones, and a cancelled layover in Reykjavik had left her running on cold coffee and stubbornness. She dropped her suitcase in the hallway, kicked off her shoes, and headed straight for the conservatory, the one room in the main estate that still smelled like her father. Old books, salt air, pipe tobacco that had soaked into the wood so deep it would probably outlive the house itself. She didn't turn on the lights. She never did in that room. Muscle memory carried her past the wicker chairs, the dead ferns nobody had watered since the funeral, toward the window seat where she liked to sit and pretend, for 5 minutes, that her father was still upstairs working. That was when she saw him. A man sat in her father's old leather chair by the cold fireplace, one leg crossed over the other, utterly relaxed, like he'd been waiting there for hours. Maybe he had. The only light in the room came from the low embers he must have lit himself, and it threw long shadows across a face she almost didn't recognize, sharper now, harder around the jaw, but unmistakably familiar in a way that made her stomach drop before her mind caught up. In his hands was her father's journal, the leather-bound one, the one that was supposed to be locked in the study safe. "Don't scream," he said before she could. "You'll wake the neighbors, and honestly, at this hour, they'd probably just assume it's the raccoons again." Vespera's hand found the brass letter opener on the side table, pathetic as a weapon, but it was something, and she held it out like it might actually stop a grown man twice her size. "Get out of my house," she said. "Now, before I call the police." "Go ahead." He didn't move. "Tell them Kalen Voss broke into your conservatory to read poetry by the fire. See how fast they show up, and see how fast they leave once they hear my name." The letter opener wavered in her grip. Kalen. The syllables landed somewhere old in her chest, a door she thought she'd nailed shut a long time ago. 10 years ago, he'd been nothing but a quiet, watchful teenager her father had taken in, some half-explained arrangement involving a debt and a favor, the kind of thing her father never fully explained to his own daughter. Kalen used to sit exactly in that chair, reading over her father's shoulder, sneaking into the kitchen after midnight for leftover pie. He used to walk her home from the library when the fog rolled in too thick to see the road. He was not supposed to be a name that made her security guard flinch when other men said it in restaurants. "You're the guard," she said slowly, like saying it out loud might make it less true. "Kalen, my father's. Your father's mentee, his project, whatever word makes you comfortable." He set the journal down on his knee, careful, almost reverent, the way you'd handle something that used to belong to someone you loved. "That was a long time ago, Vespera. People change. Circumstances change people faster. Don't you recognize me?" The question hit sideways, because it wasn't really a question. It was an accusation. "You forgot me. You buried this the second I stopped being useful to you." She lowered the letter opener an inch. Not because she trusted him, because some traitorous part of her chest still remembered a boy who used to bring her hot chocolate when she cried over calculus exams, and that boy was apparently sitting 3 feet away from her, wearing a $2,000 coat and an expression that belonged to someone who had buried people. "I know exactly who you are," she said. "That's the problem. You run the Voss Syndicate. Half the city is afraid to say your name out loud in public. And you're sitting in my father's chair, holding his private journal at 11 o'clock at night. So, no, Kalen, I don't recognize you. Not anymore." Something flickered across his face. Not anger, something closer to grief, gone before she could name it for certain. "Sit down," he said quietly. "You're going to want to." "I'll stand." "Fine." He exhaled, and for the first time since she'd walked in, he looked less like a man in control of a room and more like someone about to detonate a bomb he'd been carrying for months. "Your brother is in trouble. Serious trouble. The kind that doesn't go away with a lawyer and an apology." Her pulse spiked. "Bartholomew? What did he do?" "He borrowed money that wasn't his to borrow." Kalen stood finally, and the firelight caught the journal still in his hand, her father's careful, slanted handwriting visible on the open page. "Syndicate money. Enough of it that when he lost it on a bad stock position, it didn't just hurt him. It put your family's name on a list of people certain very unpleasant men would like to make an example of. The letter opener slipped from her fingers and clattered against the hardwood floor. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Bartholomew works in finance. He wouldn't. He couldn't." "He did. 3 months ago. I've been keeping the wolves off your porch since then, Vespera, but I can't do it forever, and I definitely can't do it from outside this house." Kalen closed the journal, gently, like he was closing a coffin. "Your father kept records, encrypted ones. I think they're the only thing that can save your brother now, and I think you're the only person alive who can read them." He held the journal out to her. "So before you throw me out," he said, "I need you to understand something. I didn't come here to hurt you. I came here because in about 6 hours, men who don't care about old friendships are going to come looking for this house, and I intend to make sure they find it empty." Vespera didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her father's journal open in front of her, staring at pages of numbers and symbols that meant nothing on their own, while Kalen made 3 phone calls in a language she didn't recognize and one in English that ended with, "If they cross the tree line, I want eyes on it in 90 seconds, not 2 minutes. By the time grey light started crawling over the water, she understood 2 things clearly. First, that the boy who used to walk her home from the library now gave orders like a man who expected them followed instantly, without question. Second, that he hadn't been exaggerating. At 5:40 a.m., a man she'd never seen before stepped through the back door without knocking, said something quiet to Kalen in that same clipped tone, and left just as fast. "They're on the property line," Kalen said. He was already moving, already pulling her suitcase back toward her, already scanning the room like he was cataloguing what mattered and what didn't. "Rival crew, not mine. They know your brother owes money, and they've decided you're worth more to them as leverage than he is." "Leverage for what?" "For me." He said it flatly, like it should have been obvious. "Pack your father's files, the archive room, the ledgers, anything with his handwriting on it. You have 4 minutes. 4 minutes? Kalen, that room has 40 years of— 3 minutes and 50 seconds now. She ran. The archive room had been her father's pride. Filing cabinets full of shipping records, correspondence, the strange, half-academic hobby that had consumed his last decade, cataloguing old maritime trade routes like they held some secret the rest of the world had forgotten to look for. Vespera swept folders into a duffel bag with shaking hands, grabbed the leather satchel her father used for fieldwork, and didn't stop to ask herself why a man who ran a criminal empire cared so much about a dead academic's paperwork. She'd ask later, if there was a later. Outside, 3 black SUVs idled in the gravel drive, engines already running, headlights cutting through the last of the fog. Kalen half-guided, half-pushed her into the middle vehicle, climbed in beside her, and the convoy pulled out before the door had fully shut. "Down," he said, and pressed a hand against her shoulder, low, until her head dropped below the window line. "Just until we clear the tree line. Habit, not paranoia. Feels like paranoia from where I'm sitting. Then be glad you've never needed the habit before." They drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, the estate shrinking behind them, replaced by pine trees, and then, gradually, the grey sprawl of the interstate. Vespera kept her eyes on the duffel bag between her feet, on the corner of her father's satchel poking out, on anything that wasn't Kalen's profile in the passenger seat ahead of her, jaw tight, eyes flicking constantly to the side mirrors. "Tell me the truth," she said finally. "All of it. Not the version where you sound like a hero." Kalen didn't turn around right away. When he did, something in his face had softened, just slightly, enough that for a second she saw the boy from the conservatory again, underneath the sharp coat and the harder jaw. "Bartholomew didn't just lose Syndicate money on a bad trade," he said. "He came to a man named Gideon Sterling 6 months ago, looking for a loan to cover a position that was already underwater. Gideon gave it to him. Gideon always gives people exactly enough rope." "And you?" "I bought the debt from Gideon 2 months ago. All of it. Every dollar your brother owes now belongs to me, not him." Vespera stared at him. Why would you do that? Because the version where Gideon owns your family's debt ends with federal agents kicking down your door, your brother in a courtroom, and your family's name in every business section in the country. Gideon wanted exactly that. He wanted the exposure, a story ugly enough to make the Syndicate look untouchable and terrified enough that no one crosses him again. Kalen's hands tightened slightly on the seat in front of him. I couldn't let that happen to your father's name. Not after everything he did for me. So you bought my brother like a used car? I bought him time, Kalen said, sharper now. Time you're about to help me use, if you want any of this to end differently than it's headed. She looked down at the satchel again. The ledger. Your father kept 2 versions of his records. The public one, in the university archive, full of maritime trivia nobody but historians care about. And a private one, hidden in that satchel, encrypted, that I think documents exactly how Gideon structured the loan to trap your brother. If we can prove Gideon engineered this deliberately, it stops being a debt problem. It becomes evidence. And you think I can read it? Your father trained you in historical cryptography before he trained anyone else. I remember watching him teach you cipher wheels at that kitchen table when you were 14. He didn't do that with Bartholomew. He did it with you. Kalen finally turned all the way around in his seat, and for the first time since the conservatory, he looked less like a Syndicate boss and more like a man asking, honestly, for help he wasn't sure he deserved. I need your archival skills, Vespera. Not because you're convenient, because you might be the only person left alive who can save your brother without a courtroom, a headline, or a body count. Outside the window, the pine trees had given way to the first grey outline of the Boston skyline, rising out of the early morning haze like something waiting. Vespera pulled the satchel into her lap and ran her thumb along the worn leather strap, the one her father used to sling over his shoulder every morning without fail. If I do this, she said quietly, I want the truth. All of it. No more half answers, no more, that was a long time ago. You brought me into your world at midnight with a letter opener pointed at your chest. The least you owe me now is honesty. Kalen held her gaze in the rearview mirror. Deal, he said. Starting with the fact that where we're headed isn't a safe house. It's my home. And once you walk through that door, Vespera, there's no version of this where you walk back out unchanged. The elevator to Kalen's penthouse required a keycard, a fingerprint scan, and, apparently, a nod from the man standing guard inside it, a giant with a neck wider than Vespera's thigh, who looked at Kalen like he was reporting for duty rather than riding an elevator. Ms. Vance, the guard said, like he already knew her name, like everyone here already knew her name. How many people know I'm here? Vespera asked as the doors slid shut. 6, Kalen said. All of them mine, all of them silent, or they answer to me personally. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. No hallway, no other doors, just floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city she'd only ever seen from tourist postcards, and a space so vast it barely looked lived in. Glass, steel, dark wood, a fireplace that had clearly never been lit. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had been decorated to apologize for itself. This is where you live? She asked. This is where I survive, Kalen said. There's a difference. He led her past a wall of monitors, 6 screens showing security footage from angles she couldn't place, ports and warehouses and streets she didn't recognize, into a smaller room with a single desk, a lamp, and enough natural light to actually work by. This was going to be a library, he said. I never got around to filling it. Consider it yours now. Vespera set the satchel down on the desk like it might detonate. You built a room and just never filled it. I kept meaning to. Then I kept getting busy running things I'm not particularly proud of. He said it without flinching, which somehow made it worse. The ledger's inside the false bottom. Careful with the stitching, your father sewed that seam himself. She found it exactly where he said, a second leather panel hidden beneath the satchel's lining, and inside it, a slim book, bound in the same dark leather as the journal from the conservatory, its pages dense with columns of numbers, symbols, and handwriting she'd know anywhere. Her chest tightened. This is his. It's yours now, too. She sat, and for the first time since London, the noise in her head went quiet, replaced by the old, familiar focus she used to fall into over her father's shoulder as a teenager. The numbers weren't random. They followed a pattern, clusters of 5, then a break, then a longer sequence that looked almost like a shipping manifest. But threaded through it were symbols she didn't recognize from any standard cipher she'd studied at the university. This isn't modern encryption, she said slowly, flipping pages. It's older. Look at the symbol set. That's not a substitution cipher. That's structured like a 19th century book cipher. You need a key text, a specific edition of a specific book, and you match positions, page, line, word. Can you find it without knowing the book? No, not in a lifetime. She looked up at him. But my father wouldn't have used just any book. He'd have used something meaningful, something he'd have wanted me to recognize if he ever needed me to find this. Kaelin leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her the way he used to watch her father work. Quiet, attentive, like he was afraid to interrupt something sacred. It struck her, uncomfortably, how much of that old reverence was still there underneath everything else he'd become. You still look at things like that, she said, like they matter more than you're allowed to admit. Careful, he said. That almost sounded like you missed me. Don't flatter yourself. But there was no real heat in it, and they both knew it. The quiet stretched a beat too long before Vespera stood, restless, and crossed to the window instead of looking at him. Boston sprawled below, grey and enormous, full of people who had no idea what kind of man ran half of it from a glass tower. How does someone go from my father's protégé to this? She asked, gesturing at the skyline, the guards, the 6 silent screens in the next room. You were 17. You cried at his funeral. I remember you standing at the back of the church so no one would see you. Kaelin's jaw tightened. You want the clean version or the true one? I told you, I want honesty. After your father died, the people who'd given him the debt that put me under his roof in the first place came looking for payment. He was gone. I was the only one left who owed them anything. Kaelin's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone raw. I had 2 options: run and let them take it out on whatever family I had left, or climb high enough inside their organization that I became someone they couldn't touch instead of someone they could collect from. So you chose power. I chose survival, and it happened to look like power from the outside. He finally met her eyes. Every decision I've made since then, Vespera, has been about making sure nobody I love ever again stands where I stood, powerless, watching the people who raised them get erased because of a debt they didn't choose. And now my family owes a debt we didn't choose. Which is exactly why I bought it, he said, because I know exactly what happens if I don't. The silence between them wasn't hostile this time. It was heavier than that, full of things unsaid for 10 years, half-formed apologies neither of them knew how to finish. Vespera turned back to the ledger, needing something solid to hold on to. I need to think like he thought. What book would he trust both of us to remember? And then, halfway through the sentence, it hit her, a memory so specific it nearly knocked the breath out of her. Cambridge, a rare addition, a place her father used to take her every summer, insisting some books belonged in vaults, not shelves. I know where the key is, she said, standing so fast the chair scraped against the floor. But it's not here. It's in a library vault 2 hours from this room, and if I'm right about which book, we don't have much time before someone else realizes it too. Kaelin didn't let her leave for Cambridge that night. Not yet, he said, when she reached for her coat. Gideon's called a council meeting for tomorrow morning. If I don't show up with an explanation for why the Vance name is suddenly my problem, he'll assume I'm hiding something worth taking. I need you seen. Once, so no one wonders. Seen where? Somewhere you're really not going to like. The next morning, a car with blacked-out windows took them beneath South Boston, down a service ramp that looked like it belonged to a parking garage, and ended, instead, at a steel door guarded by two men who checked Kaylin's face before they checked anything else. Behind the door was a room Vespera hadn't known existed under any city, low-lit, windowless, a long table surrounded by men in expensive suits who all stopped talking the second she walked in. "This is the archivist," Kaylin said, before anyone could ask. "She's under my protection. That's the only introduction any of you need." At the head of the table sat a man who didn't stand when Kaylin entered, which Vespera understood, instinctively, as a kind of insult. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, silver at the temples, a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Gideon Sterling," he said, extending a hand she didn't take. "You'll forgive me if I don't get up. Old knees, older grudges." "Gideon," Kaylin said, "runs distribution for the Northeast Corridor, also runs his mouth more than the council appreciates." A ripple of quiet laughter went around the table, though it died fast when Gideon's smile didn't move. "Careful, Voss," Gideon said, still pleasant, still terrible. "You've spent 2 months burning favors and moving money to protect a dead man's daughter. Some of us are starting to wonder if the Syndicate's being run for its members or for your sentimental attachments." "The Vance debt is settled business," Kaylin said. "I bought it. It's mine to manage. That ends the discussion." "Does it?" Gideon leaned back, unhurried, a man who clearly enjoyed the sound of his own patience. "Because from where I'm sitting, you've brought a civilian, an outsider no less, into a room she was never supposed to see to solve a problem that isn't the council's to solve. That's not settled business. That's exposure. And exposure gets people finished, Kaylin. Sometimes people who never asked to be involved in the first place." His eyes flicked to Vespera when he said it, deliberate, unhurried, and she understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that it wasn't a warning. It was a threat wearing a warning's clothes. "You have something to say to me," Kaylin said, voice gone flat and dangerous in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. "Say it to me, not through her." "I'm only pointing out what the rest of the table is too polite to say." Gideon spread his hands, magnanimous, reasonable, poisonous. "You've gone soft since her father died. Everyone here remembers who trained you, Kaylin. We remember whose ring you kissed before you ever earned the right to sit at this table yourself. Maybe that's clouding your judgment now." "My judgment," Kaylin said, "put every man in this room in the position he currently holds. I don't answer to nostalgia, Gideon. I answer to results. And the Vance situation is a result, a debt collected, a threat neutralized, a story that never has to touch federal ears if it's handled correctly. If any of you would prefer I mishandle it loudly enough to bring the FBI to this table instead, say so now." Silence. Nobody said so. Gideon's jaw ticked, just slightly, the only crack in an otherwise perfect performance. "Handle it quietly then," he said. "But understand something, Voss. If your archivist becomes a liability instead of a solution, the council won't wait for your permission to correct the problem." "Try it," Kaylin said, "and you'll learn exactly how much of my restraint has been a choice, not a limitation." The meeting ended shortly after, clipped, formal, everyone filing out with the particular quiet of men who just watched 2 apex predators circle each other without drawing blood. Vespera didn't breathe easy until they were back in the car, back above ground, sunlight hitting her face for the first time in what felt like hours. "He knows you bought the debt to protect me," she said. "Specifically me, not just the family name." "Gideon knows everything he can use," Kaylin said grimly. "That's what makes him dangerous. He doesn't need facts. He collects leverage." "You think he'll come after me?" Kaylin didn't answer right away, which was, in its own way, an answer. "I think," he said finally, "that Gideon has spent 6 months positioning your brother's debt as a weakness he can exploit against me personally, and I think today he found out exactly which weakness matters most." Vespera turned to look at him, and for the first time she let herself really see it. Not the Syndicate boss, not the boy from the conservatory, but the exhaustion underneath both versions. the toll of holding an empire together with one hand while trying to protect the last people he had left with the other. "Then we move faster," she said. "Cambridge, tonight, before Gideon decides waiting isn't worth his patience anymore." Behind them, unseen, Gideon Sterling stood at the window of the Underground Club's private office, watching their car pull away on a security feed no one had told them existed, already dialing a number of his own. "She's more than an archivist," he said quietly when the call connected. "Find out everything about Vespera Vance. Everything. I want to know exactly what Kalen Voss can't afford to lose." The Harvard Rare Book Vault didn't officially exist on any public map, a sublevel beneath the main library, accessible only through a service corridor that smelled like dust and old paper, guarded by a security system Kalen's people had apparently studied months ago, for reasons Vespera decided not to ask about. "You knew about this place before tonight," she said, watching him bypass a keypad with a small device that looked more surgical than criminal. "I knew your father donated a private collection here after he retired," Kalen said. "I didn't know why until you told me in the car. Now move. We've got maybe 11 minutes before the second patrol loops back." Inside, the vault was climate-controlled, silent, rows of glass cases holding manuscripts too fragile for daylight. Vespera moved through them with a strange, aching familiarity. She'd been here before, years ago, trailing behind her father while he lectured a bored 18-year-old about the importance of primary sources. He'd stopped in front of one case longer than any other. She remembered that. She just hadn't understood, until tonight, why. "There," she said, stopping at a case near the back wall. Inside sat a slim, unassuming volume, a first edition of an obscure maritime survey her father had donated the year before he died, the kind of book no thief would ever bother with. "This is it." He used to say this book taught him more about patience than any professor ever did. He said it to me exactly once, and he made sure I remembered it. Kalen worked the case open with careful, practiced hands, lifting the book like it might crumble under too much pressure. "You're sure?" "I'm sure enough to bet my brother's life on it," she said, which, considering the circumstances, is exactly what I'm doing. They worked fast after that, Vespera flipping through brittle pages by the light of Kalen's phone while he watched the corridor, cross-referencing page numbers against the cipher's structure in the ledger she'd brought folded inside her coat. The pattern clicked into place faster than she expected. Page 7, line 3, word 12. Page 19, line 1, word 4, until whole sequences of numbers resolved into something almost like language. "It's working," she breathed. "Kalen, it's actually working." He crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the climate-controlled cold, close enough that for a moment neither of them was thinking about Gideon or debts or council meetings, just two people hunched over a book, exactly the way they used to be a decade ago, before either of them had learned what the world could cost. "You used to do this at the kitchen table," he said quietly. "Same face, same focus. You'd forget I was even in the room." "I never forgot you were in the room," she said, and regretted it the second it left her mouth, because it was too honest, too close to a truth she hadn't meant to hand him. Kalen went still. "Vespera." "Don't," she said. "Not here, not like this." "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just need you to know. I never forgot either. Not once, in 10 years. I told myself I did. It was easier that way." For a moment, the vault around them disappeared, the glass cases, the dust, the danger waiting somewhere above ground, and it was just the two of them, the space between their faces smaller than it had been in a decade, something old and unfinished rising back up between them like it had never actually left. Then Kalen's phone buzzed once against his palm, a single sharp vibration that broke the moment instantly. He read the message, and his expression changed completely. Soldier again, not boy. "Movement outside. 2 vehicles, unmarked. They weren't there when we came in." Gideon? Or someone he sent? Kalen was already moving, sliding the ledger and the book into his coat. "We need to go, now." They came out of the vault into the service corridor at a run, and Vespera heard it before she saw it. Voices, low and clipped, echoing from the direction of the main stairwell. The unmistakable sound of people who weren't supposed to be there and weren't trying particularly hard to hide it. "This way," Kaylin said, pulling her hard left, away from the stairs, toward a narrow door she hadn't noticed before. "Campus utility access. It connects to the old steam tunnels under the quad. Ugly, but it'll get us 6 blocks away before anyone realizes we're gone." The tunnels were exactly as bad as the name suggested. Low ceilings, dripping pipes, air thick with heat and mildew, barely enough light to see 2 steps ahead. Vespera ran with the satchel clutched against her chest, Kaylin's hand wrapped around her wrist, guiding her through turns he seemed to know by memory, until the sound of pursuit behind them faded into nothing but their own ragged breathing. They surfaced through a maintenance grate 2 blocks from the river, cold night air hitting Vespera's lungs like a slap, both of them gasping, both of them alive. "You knew the tunnels," she managed between breaths. "Why do you know the tunnels?" "Because I learned a long time ago," Kaylin said, checking the street in both directions before pulling her toward a waiting car she hadn't even noticed idling at the curb, "that anyone worth protecting deserves at least 3 ways out of every room they walk into." In the back seat, safe for the moment, Vespera finally let herself look down at what she was holding. The ledger, the maritime survey, and folded inside her coat pocket, a torn scrap of paper that had fallen loose from the book's spine in the chaos of the escape. A single line of her father's handwriting, not encrypted, not hidden, just 6 words, written like he'd known, somehow, that she'd be the one to find them. "Trust no one but Kaylin. He knows." The seaport loft belonged to no one Kaylin would name. "A friend who owes me a favor and doesn't ask questions," was all he'd say. But it was warm, anonymous, and far enough from both the Syndicate's usual territory and Harvard's rattled security patrols that Vespera finally let her shoulders drop for the first time in 2 days. She hadn't stopped thinking about the note. "Trust no one but Kaylin. He knows." "Knows what?" she asked, the second the loft door locked behind them. "My father wrote that like it was supposed to mean something to you. What does he know, Kaylin?" Kaylin's face did something complicated, guarded, then guilty, then resigned, all in the space of a breath. "Your father figured out something about Gideon almost a year before he died. He never told me the specifics. He told me to protect the ledger if anything ever happened to him, and to protect you specifically, no matter what it cost. I thought it was about money. I didn't think it was about—" He stopped himself. "About what?" "Let's finish decoding it," he said. "Then you can be angry at both of us with all the facts instead of half of them." She let it go, for now, because the alternative was standing in a stranger's loft, screaming at a man she still didn't fully trust, and because some greedy, exhausted part of her wanted the answer to come from the ledger itself, her father's own words, not a second-hand version filtered through Kaylin's guilt. They worked through the night at a kitchen table that reminded her too much of the one at home. Page by page, word by word, the cipher unraveled under her hands, the maritime survey's positions unlocking sequences that had sat encrypted for months, maybe longer. Kaylin brought her coffee she didn't drink and stood behind her chair, silent, watching the pages fill in like a man watching a verdict get written in real time. By 4 in the morning, the picture was whole, and it was worse than either of them had imagined. "Bartholomew didn't act alone," Vespera said slowly, reading it a second time to be sure she hadn't misunderstood. "He didn't even act first. Look at the dates. Gideon approached Bartholomew 8 months ago, before the loan, before the stock losses, before any of it. He didn't lend to a desperate man, he built a desperate man." Kaylin leaned over her shoulder, reading the same lines. "He manufactured the debt. He fed Bartholomew a series of opportunities through a shell fund, bad positions dressed up as sure things, each one a little worse than the last, until my brother was so far underwater that the Syndicate loan looked like a rescue instead of a trap." Her hands were shaking now, not from cold. "This wasn't about money, Kaylin. This was never about money. Gideon needed a reason to put the Vance name, and by extension you, in a position where he could either control you or destroy you in front of the entire council. And the second part of the ledger? Kaylin's voice had gone quiet in a way that scared her more than shouting would have. She turned the page. There, in her father's careful hand, decoded at last. Gideon Sterling had been skimming from the Syndicate's own accounts for 3 years, funneling percentages of every shipment through accounts disguised as legitimate maritime logistics fees. The same industry, she realized with a cold jolt, that her father had spent his retirement quietly, obsessively researching. He hadn't stumbled onto Gideon's scheme by accident. He'd been building a case against it, page by careful page, for years. "He knew," Vespera whispered. "My father knew what Gideon was doing to the Syndicate long before any of this touched our family. That's what the note meant. He knows, not you, Kaylin, Gideon. My father was building proof against him, and somehow Gideon found out." "And silenced the one man who could expose him," Kaylin said, something dark and furious moving behind his eyes. "By making sure his death looked natural, and making sure his son owed a debt deep enough to bury the daughter's credibility if she ever tried to finish what he started." The full shape of it landed on Vespera like a physical weight. Her father hadn't just died of a weak heart at a bad time. Her father had died protecting a truth that Gideon Sterling had spent years hiding, and Bartholomew's debt hadn't been an accident of bad luck. It had been insurance, purchased in advance, against exactly this moment. "We have to move on this immediately," she said, already gathering the pages. "If Gideon finds out we've decoded this." The lights went out. Not flickered, cut, all at once, the loft plunging into total darkness with a suddenness that told Vespera, with sick certainty, that it hadn't been an accident of the building's wiring. "Down," Kaylin said, already pulling her below the table, his voice gone hard and low. "Now." Glass shattered somewhere near the door, boots on hardwood, more than 2 sets, moving fast and coordinated in a way that told her this wasn't a random break-in. This was planned, timed, executed by people who'd known exactly where to find them. "Vespera Vance," a voice called out into the dark, almost pleasant, almost bored. "Mr. Sterling sends his regards, and a request that you come with us quietly. He's very eager to discuss what your father left you." Kaylin's hand found hers in the darkness, gripping hard, and in the half-second before the loft erupted into chaos, she heard him say the only thing that mattered. "Whatever happens next, don't let go of that ledger. It's the only thing standing between your brother and a grave, and it's the only thing that can end Gideon for good." Then the room exploded into motion, and there was no more time to be afraid. Kaylin went down first, not from a bullet, but from sheer numbers, 3 men driving him into the kitchen counter, while a 4th wrenched Vespera's arms behind her back before she'd even managed to stand. "Kaylin!" she screamed, and saw him twist free just long enough to put one man on the floor before 2 more grabbed him again, saw the flash of a blade at his ribs that he barely angled away from in time. "Take her!" someone barked. "Leave him breathing. Mr. Sterling wants him conscious for this." They dragged her out through the shattered door with a bag over her head before she could see anything more, the ledger's pages crushed against her chest where she'd shoved them inside her coat in the first seconds of the raid, instinct over thought, the one thing she'd managed to save. She didn't know if Kaylin was alive behind her. She didn't know anything except the rough hands on her arms and the cold night air replacing the loft's warmth as they threw her into a van. The drive felt like an hour. It was probably 20 minutes. When the bag came off, she was in a warehouse, cavernous, cold, smelling of rust and old seawater, exposed steel beams rising into darkness overhead. Charlestown, she guessed, from the brief glimpse of the shipyard cranes she'd caught through the van's rear window. A single work light hung above a folding chair in the center of the room, and beyond its glow, shapes of men shifted in the shadows, waiting. Gideon Sterling stepped into the light himself, unhurried, hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like a man arriving fashionably late to his own dinner party. "Miss Vance," he said. "I do apologize for the theatrics. Kalen's people are excessively difficult to negotiate with under normal circumstances, so I've found direct methods tend to save everyone time. "Where is he?" she demanded. "What did you do to him?" "He's alive, if that's what worries you. Occupied, currently, with the small army I left storming his precious loft. He'll come for you eventually, probably sooner than's wise for him." Gideon crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to her eye level, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, which made it worse. "What I actually want, Vespera, is much simpler than blood. I want the ledger, your father's private one. I know you have it, because I know exactly what's in it." She kept her face still, though her heart was hammering hard enough she was certain he could see it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please," Gideon smiled, thin and humorless. "Your father spent 3 years quietly documenting exactly how I structure certain transactions. I've spent nearly as long making sure nobody ever found that documentation. Imagine my surprise when Kalen Voss, sentimental fool that he is, decided to personally deliver it to me by dragging you and it into the middle of a war he thought he could win quietly." He straightened, circling her chair slowly, and she made herself track him, refused to let him see her flinch. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued. "You're going to tell me where the ledger is. I'll retrieve it, destroy it, and you and your brother will walk away from all of this with your lives and your family's tarnished but survivable reputation. Refuse, and I stop being generous." Vespera thought fast, the shape of a plan forming even as fear tried to swallow it whole. She didn't have the ledger's location to give him, she had the actual ledger, pressed against her ribs under her coat, close enough that a careless search would find it in seconds. What she had, instead, was information. Knowledge Gideon didn't yet know she possessed. "You're going to skim their payouts," she said instead, watching his face carefully. "Aren't you? The lieutenants standing behind you right now, the ones who think they're here defending your honor, you're planning to cut them out the same way you cut out my father. The ledger doesn't just document what you did to my family, it documents 3 years of stolen shipment percentages that were supposed to go to every man in this warehouse." The shift in the room was subtle but unmistakable. A stillness among the shadows behind Gideon. Men who'd been standing at ease, suddenly not quite as relaxed. Gideon's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating. "That's a very creative bluff." "Is it?" Vespera let herself smile back, thin and dangerous, borrowing something from the way Kalen had spoken to him at the council table. "You said it yourself. You know exactly what's in that ledger, because you spent years making sure my father never finished proving it." Except he did finish, Gideon. Every account, every shell fund, every dollar you've quietly diverted from your own men's cut while telling them the Syndicate's margins were shrinking industry-wide. I've read every page. Your lieutenants are standing behind a man who's been robbing them for 3 years and calling it strategy. "Careful," Gideon said, low, all pretense of pleasantness gone now. "Ask them," she pressed, nodding past his shoulder at the men in the shadows. "Ask any one of them what their percentage was supposed to be 5 years ago and what it is now. Ask them if the math ever added up the way you told them it did." For the first time since she'd walked into that warehouse, Gideon Sterling looked less like a man in complete control and more like one who just felt the floor shift very slightly beneath his feet. And behind him, in the dark, she heard the unmistakable sound of men who'd stopped listening to him and started listening to her instead. The warehouse doors blew inward 11 minutes later, not with an explosion, but with the precise, controlled violence of men who'd done this before. Kalen at the front of them, blood dried along one temple, moving like nothing in the world could slow him down. Gideon's men scattered toward cover on instinct, weapons up, but Vespera noticed something that made her chest tighten with a strange, fragile hope. Half of them hesitated. Half of them looked at each other first, uncertain, before they looked at Gideon for orders. "Stand down," Kalen's voice cut through the chaos, not shouted, just absolute. "Every man in this room who isn't Gideon Sterling has 30 seconds to decide whose side of this he actually wants to be on." "Kalen." Gideon's composure was cracking now, visible in the tightness around his mouth. "This doesn't need to end badly. This is a business disagreement. Let's discuss it like... Like what? Kalen crossed the warehouse floor without hurrying, without a single glance toward the men still holding weapons, because he knew, Vespera realized, exactly how this moment was going to play out before it happened. Like the businessman who finished a retired historian because he was 3 months from proving you'd been robbing your own crew for years. The room went very still. That's an accusation with no proof, Gideon said, but his voice had lost its silk. Wrong. Kalen pulled a phone from his coat and held it up, and Vespera understood, in a rush of relief so sharp it nearly buckled her knees, exactly what he'd been doing in the 20 minutes it had taken him to reach her. I've had a copy of the decoded ledger for the last hour. Vespera's people at the loft got the pages out before your men finished tearing the place apart. And right now, every phone in this warehouse belonging to a Syndicate lieutenant is receiving the same file. Phones began buzzing in pockets around the room, a low, uneven chorus, men glancing down instinctively even as they tried to keep their weapons trained on Kalen's crew. One by one, faces changed. Vespera watched years of loyalty curdle into something colder as men who'd followed Gideon Sterling for a decade started reading, in their own hands, exactly how much of their own earnings he'd been quietly stealing. 3 years, Kalen said, letting the silence stretch, letting the numbers do the work no gun ever could. 3 years, Gideon, skimming percentages off every shipment while telling this room margins were down industry-wide. You didn't just rob a dead man's family. You robbed every single person standing behind you right now. Lies, Gideon said, but it came out thin, unconvincing, a man realizing the ground had already shifted beneath him before he'd finished denying it. One of the lieutenants, a broad-shouldered man Vespera recognized vaguely from the council table, the one who'd laughed loudest at Kalen's insult days earlier, lowered his weapon first. Then another. It spread through the room like a current, men who'd sworn loyalty to Gideon suddenly finding that loyalty had a price they'd only just discovered they'd been paying. You son of a... Gideon reached for something inside his coat, fast, desperate, and Vespera's stomach dropped. But the broad-shouldered lieutenant was faster. He crossed the distance in 2 strides and drove Gideon face first into the concrete floor before the movement finished, knee planted between his shoulder blades, voice shaking with a fury that had clearly been building far longer than tonight. 3 years, the man said, low and furious, echoing Kalen's words back at their source. My daughter's tuition, my sister's medical bills. You told me the margins were down. You told all of us the margins were down. Gideon didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't damn him further. Kalen crossed to Vespera at last, and the second his hands closed around her shoulders, checking her over with a kind of frantic gentleness that undid every ounce of composure she'd been holding onto through the entire ordeal, she felt her legs finally threaten to give out. You're bleeding, she said, reaching for the cut along his temple with a hand that wouldn't quite stop shaking. It's not mine, mostly, he said, which wasn't reassuring in the slightest. Are you hurt? No, She looked past him, at Gideon pinned to the floor, at his lieutenants standing over him with expressions that had gone from confusion to fury to something like grim resolve, and felt the whole impossible weight of the last 4 days finally start to loosen its grip on her chest. I told them what he'd done. I didn't know if it would work. It worked because it was true, Kalen said. That's the one thing Gideon never counted on. He built an empire on lies he thought no one would ever be able to prove. He never imagined a historian's daughter would be smart enough, or brave enough, to finish what her father started. Behind them, the broad-shouldered lieutenant hauled Gideon to his feet, hands bound now with something improvised and rough, and looked to Kalen with the unmistakable posture of a man waiting for orders he intended to follow without question. What do you want done with him? The man asked. Kalen didn't answer right away. He looked at Vespera instead, at the ledger's pages still visible at the edge of her coat, at everything her father had died protecting finally within reach of doing what it was meant to do. Not what your instincts are telling you to do, Kalen said finally. Gideon doesn't get the mercy of disappearing quietly, and he doesn't get the excuse of dying a martyr to some story about betrayal within the ranks. He gets exactly what he tried to bury for 3 years. The truth, in full, in front of people who can actually make it matter. He turned to Vespera. "There's one more move left in this," he said, "and it's not one I can make alone. You're the one who can put this in front of people who'll actually listen, people with badges, not blades." The Federal Plaza building didn't look like a place where empires ended. It looked like every other grey government building Vespera had ever walked past without noticing. Fluorescent lights, tired carpet, a receptionist who barely glanced up as Kalen signed them both in under names that weren't quite lies, but weren't quite the whole truth either. "You're sure about this?" she said, for the 3rd time since they'd left the warehouse 2 days earlier. "Walking into a federal building. You. Voluntarily. I'm sure it's the only version of this that actually protects your brother permanently," Kalen said. "Gideon's lieutenants can turn on him in a warehouse, but that doesn't erase the file the DOJ's already building on Syndicate operations. If I want Bartholomew clear, really clear, not just safe from Gideon, this has to happen in daylight, with paperwork, in front of people who can make it stick." "And what happens to you?" He didn't answer that one directly, which told her more than any answer would have. They were shown into a conference room on the 11th floor, sparse and clinical, where a woman in a grey suit was already waiting with a legal pad and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. She introduced herself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Renata Cho, shook both their hands with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd sat across from far more dangerous people than a nervous archivist and a syndicate boss turning state's evidence, and got straight to business. "You called this meeting," Cho said, looking at Kalen. "I have to say, Mr. Voss, that's not the usual order of operations. Most of the men in your position wait for us to come knocking." "Most of the men in my position don't have proof of a decade of financial fraud handed to them by the daughter of the man who documented it," Kalen said. "I'm not here to negotiate my own exposure, Ms. Cho. I'm here because Vespera has evidence that clears an innocent man and convicts a genuinely dangerous one, and she deserves the chance to present it without it costing her family everything in the process." Cho's eyes moved to Vespera, sharpening with the first real flicker of interest since they'd sat down. "Then let's hear it." Vespera laid out the ledger's pages one by one across the table, walking Cho through everything with the same careful, methodical precision her father had taught her over a decade of kitchen table cipher lessons. The shell fund Gideon had used to manufacture Bartholomew's debt, the manufactured opportunities that had bled her brother dry on purpose, the 3 years of skimmed shipment percentages hidden inside logistics fees dressed up to look legitimate. She explained the book cipher, the maritime survey, the way her father had built an entire second life documenting a crime he must have known, eventually, would cost him everything. Cho listened without interrupting once, her pen moving steadily across the legal pad, and when Vespera finally finished, the silence in the room stretched long enough that Vespera wondered if she'd said too much, or not enough, or the wrong thing entirely. "This is remarkably thorough," Cho said finally. "More thorough, frankly, than most of what my office manages to build in 18 months of active investigation. Your father was clearly very good at what he did." "He was," Vespera said, and felt the old grief rise, sharp and sudden, in a room that had no business making her cry. "Here's what I can offer," Cho said, turning a page on her legal pad, all business now. "Given the documentary evidence and Mr. Sterling's existing exposure through separate channels my office has already been developing, we have grounds to pursue Sterling directly on financial fraud and racketeering charges without needing your brother's testimony as the centerpiece. That means Bartholomew Vance's cooperation, a full account of the loan, the pressure applied to him, and his willingness to surrender his financial licenses voluntarily can be structured as a cooperating witness agreement. No prosecution, full immunity contingent on that cooperation." Vespera felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in 5 days. "He won't go to prison." "Not if he cooperates fully and immediately, no. He'll lose his ability to practice in finance, likely permanently. That's the cost of the mistake he made, and frankly, it's a lighter cost than he probably deserves given how badly this could have gone." Cho's eyes shifted to Kalen. Your situation is more complicated, Mr. Voss. I know. You're voluntarily providing evidence against a fellow syndicate leader, which my office is grateful for and which will be noted. It doesn't erase the rest of your file. Cho leaned back slightly. But I'll say this much. A man who could have buried this evidence to protect himself and instead walked it into a federal building to protect an innocent family is not the profile my office usually deals with. That matters. It won't clear you, but it matters. Kalen nodded once, like he'd expected exactly that answer and had made peace with it long before they'd walked through the door. They spent another 2 hours in that conference room, authenticating pages, signing statements, watching Cho's team photograph and catalog every piece of the ledger with the careful reverence of people who understood, even without knowing him, exactly how much work had gone into building it. By the time they finally left the building, evening light slanting gold across the plaza outside, Vespera felt lighter and heavier all at once. Her brother's safe, her father's work finally seen by the people it was always meant for, and Kalen walking beside her, carrying a weight she wasn't sure federal immunity could ever fully lift. He's going to hate this, Vespera said, thinking of Bartholomew, of the phone call she still had to make, of a brother who'd spent his whole life being the golden one and was about to lose the only career he'd ever wanted. Losing his license, losing the whole life he built. He's going to hate it, Kalen agreed, but he's going to be alive to hate it and free to rebuild something else. That's more than Gideon was ever going to give him. Vespera looked at him in the fading light, bruised, tired, still carrying the particular stillness of a man who'd just handed federal prosecutors a portion of his own future in exchange for someone else's, and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how much he'd been willing to lose for her family, and for her. "Kalen," she said quietly, "what happens to you now?" He didn't answer her question that evening. It took him 3 more days to give her one, 3 days of federal follow-up calls, of Bartholomew's tearful, furious, ultimately grateful phone call from his lawyer's office, of Gideon Sterling's arrest hitting local news under a headline that undersold the whole story by half. 3 days of Vespera watching Kalen disappear into meetings she wasn't invited to, emerging each time a little more like a man carrying something heavy toward a door he finally intended to walk through. On the 4th day, he asked her to come with him to the harbor. The Voss Maritime Logistics Office sat at the edge of the water, a squat brick building dwarfed by the cranes and container ships around it, unremarkable in every way, except that Vespera recognized the name instantly, the same industry her father had spent his retirement quietly researching, the same shipping routes and manifests that had filled his study for years. "This is real," she said, standing in the doorway of an office that smelled like coffee and salt air instead of gunmetal and threat. "An actual, legitimate company." "It's been real for 2 years," Kalen said. "I built it quietly, on the side, moving assets a little at a time so nobody in the syndicate noticed how much of my attention it was taking. I told myself it was insurance, a place to land, eventually, if I ever found a way out." He gestured at the desk, at the ledgers spread across it, real ones this time, unencrypted, ordinary. "I never told your father directly what I was building, but I think he knew. I think that's part of why he trusted me with you and with this before he died." Vespera moved through the office slowly, running her fingers along a wall map marked with shipping routes that echoed, almost exactly, the ones from her father's old maritime survey. This is what the note meant. Not just trust him because he knows about Gideon, trust him because he's already building the thing that comes after. "I made your father a promise, the year before he died," Kalen said quietly. "He asked me once, out of nowhere, over dinner, whether I ever thought about a version of my life that didn't end in a warehouse or a courtroom. I laughed it off. He didn't. He made me promise that if I ever found a way to build something clean, I'd take it. I think he already suspected, even then, that Gideon was going to force my hand eventually. I think he wanted to make sure that when it happened, I had somewhere to go that wasn't just deeper into the syndicate." Over the following weeks, Vespera watched him make good on it, not with the dramatic finality of a single decision, but with the slow, exhausting work of dismantling something that had taken a decade to build. He met with the council. What remained of it after Gideon's arrest sent tremors through the entire structure and transferred control of the Syndicate's illicit operations to an independent council of lieutenants who'd already proven, in that Charlestown warehouse, that they valued honesty over blind loyalty. He kept nothing for himself but the maritime company and its legitimate contracts, walking away from everything else with a finality that surprised even the men who'd worked under him for years. "You're really doing it," Vespera said one evening, watching him sign the last of the transfer paperwork at the harbour office, papers spread across a desk that had somehow, over the weeks, become as familiar to her as her father's old study. "Walking away from all of it?" "I already walked away," Kalen said, "the moment I bought your brother's debt instead of letting Gideon collect on it. Everything since then has just been paperwork catching up to a decision I made in your conservatory." She sat across from him, in a chair that had become hers without either of them ever quite deciding it should be. "The council let you leave that easily?" "Nothing about it was easy," he said. "But a man who exposed Gideon Sterling's theft and handed federal prosecutors a case that could have taken years to build otherwise earns a certain amount of goodwill, even from people who don't fully trust him. I used every bit of it. I don't regret spending it this way." Outside the window, the harbour moved with its usual evening rhythm, cranes lifting containers, gulls circling low over the water, the ordinary business of a city that had no idea how close it had come, weeks earlier, to a very different kind of story. Vespera watched it, feeling something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not safety, exactly. Something steadier than that. Something closer to the beginning of a life she was allowed to actually choose. "Bartholomew starts his consulting work next month," she said. "Nothing glamorous. He hates it already, and he hasn't even started." "He's alive to hate it," Kalen said, echoing his own words from the Federal Plaza steps, and she caught the small, tired smile underneath it, the first real one she'd seen from him in days. "What about you?" she asked. "Once the paperwork's done, once the council's settled, what do you actually want, Kalen? Not what you owe people, not what you're rebuilding for someone else's sake. What do you want?" He set down his pen and looked at her for a long moment, the harbour light catching the same sharp jaw, the same watchful eyes she'd first seen across a dark conservatory a month ago, except softer now, unburdened in a way she hadn't realized was possible for him until she saw it happen in real time. "I want to finish what I started the night I walked into your father's house," he said. "I want to find out what it looks like to build something with you instead of just for you. I've spent 10 years protecting your family from a distance, Vespera, telling myself that was enough. I don't want distance anymore." She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The answer had been building in her, quietly, through every warehouse and every vault and every quiet hour hunched over her father's ledger. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that plane a month ago, she let herself reach across the desk and take his hand, without a single reason to pull it back. The drive back to Maine took 4 hours, and for the first time in a month, Vespera spent every one of them without checking the rearview mirror. Kalen drove himself this time. No convoy, no scouts radioing ahead, no black SUVs idling at the property line. Just his own car, windows down enough to let the salt air in as the coastline came into view. Pine trees giving way to the familiar grey shingles of the estate she'd left in the dark, once believing she was walking into a stranger's ambush. "It looks smaller," she said, as the house came into view. "Or maybe I just got used to looking at a skyline." "It looks exactly the way I remember it," Kalen said, standing at the edge of that driveway at 17, wondering if your father was really going to let someone like me sleep under his roof. "He never had doubts about you. I used to resent that a little. He trusted you with things he never explained to me." "He trusted you with the harder thing," Kalen said, pulling into the drive and cutting the engine. "He trusted you to finish what he started, if it ever came to that. I don't think he ever doubted you'd be capable of it. I think he just hoped you'd never have to find out." They walked up the porch steps together, and Vespera noticed with a small ache that someone, Kaelin, she realized, without having to ask, had already had the dead ferns in the conservatory replaced, the brass letter opener returned to its exact spot on the side table, the whole room restored to something closer to what it had looked like before that night. Not erased, just cared for. The way you'd tend a wound you didn't want to forget existed, only wanted to stop hurting. "You did this," she said, standing in the doorway of the conservatory, sunlight where firelight had been the last time she'd stood in this spot. "I had some time," he said. "And I wanted the first thing you saw, coming back here, to be something other than the worst night of your life." She crossed to the fireplace, to the chair her father used to sit in, the one Kaelin had been sitting in the night everything changed. She didn't sit in it. She stood beside it instead, looking at the room the way she'd looked at it 100 times in the past, safe, familiar, hers. "I keep thinking about the note," she said. "Trust no one but Kaelin. He knows. I used to think it was a warning, now I think it was something else. I think he was trying to tell me something he never got the chance to say out loud." "What do you think it was?" "That you were already family," she said, "before any of this happened. Before the debt, before Gideon, before any of it. I think my father wrote that note because he already knew, even then, that whatever happened to him, you'd be the one who came back for us. Not out of obligation, because you never really left in the first place." Kaelin was quiet for a long moment, looking at the room the way she'd once caught him looking at her father's journal, reverent, careful, like something precious he still wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to hold. "I used to think I owed your father a debt I could never fully repay," he said finally. "The Syndicate, the years he spent teaching me, the roof he put over my head when I had nowhere else to go. I spent a decade building an empire I told myself was payment for that debt. It never felt like enough. Nothing I built ever felt like enough." He turned to face her fully. "It wasn't until I walked back into this room 5 weeks ago that I understood what he actually wanted from me. Not an empire, not power, just this, just you, safe, in a house that still felt like home. And now?" "Now the debt's paid," he said. "Not because of anything I did, because of everything you did. You're the one who decoded the ledger. You're the one who talked Gideon's own men into turning on him. You're the one who walked into a federal building and told the truth even when it would have been easier not to. I just opened the door that night. You're the one who walked through it and changed everything on the other side." Vespera felt her throat tighten, the particular ache of grief and gratitude tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other anymore. For her father, for the version of herself who'd stepped off that plane a month ago, believing her life was simple, for the strange, impossible turn it had taken instead. "I don't want you to leave tonight," she said, and the words came out steadier than she expected, certain in a way that surprised her. "Not as my father's old protégé checking on the family estate. Not as a guard making sure the debt's fully settled. I want you to stay because I'm asking you to, Kaelin. Not as a bodyguard, not as a mob boss with a guilty conscience. As someone I choose, equally, on purpose." Kaelin crossed the room, slow, like he wanted to remember every second of it, and stopped close enough that she could see the exact moment something in him finally, fully let go of the weight he'd been carrying since the night he sat in her father's chair with a journal he had no right to be holding. "I spent 10 years telling myself distance was protection," he said quietly. "That loving you from far away was safer than loving you up close. Because up close meant something to lose. I don't want to be that careful anymore, Vespera. I don't want to protect you from the edge of a room. I want to build whatever comes next, standing right beside you." Outside, the sun dropped low over the water, gold light spilling through the conservatory windows the way it used to when her father was still alive to see it. The same room, the same light, an entirely different story than the one that had started there 5 weeks earlier. Vespera reached for his hand, the way she had at that harbour desk weeks ago. Except this time there was no ledger between them, no debt, no danger waiting outside the door. Just a house that finally, fully, felt like home again. And a man standing in it who had never really been a stranger at all. Only someone she'd spent 10 years forgetting how to recognize, until the night he asked her the one question that changed everything. "Don't you recognize me?" She did now, completely, and without a single doubt left standing between them.